The pressure suited my soul. It was a tangible weight, a constant reminder of the ocean's indifferent power, and yet for me it was a balm. Down here at the abyssal edge of the world, the static of the surface faded, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. I was Marcus Blake, and this was my domain, or it would be once we roused Triton Station from its long slumber. Our submersible, the Nautilus II, was a cramped metal sarcophagus, its viewport a single eye peering into an eternal night. Outside, the crushing blackness was absolute, broken only by the occasional bioluminescent flicker of unseen creatures, like distant, dying stars. My two colleagues, the lead engineer and the station's former operations manager, sat opposite me, their faces illuminated by the console glow, a mixture of apprehension and forced stoicism etched onto their features. We were a small crew, chosen for our specific expertise, and I suspected our willingness to chase ghosts. Approaching primary docking port, the engineer's voice crackled over the intercom, a thin thread of sound in the oppressive quiet. His fingers danced over a holographic interface, bringing up schematics of the station's exterior. Triton. My own pulse quickened, not from fear, but from a fierce, almost primal anticipation. For years, I'd studied the theoretical geology of deep-sea trenches, the impossible pressures, the unique mineral formations. But Triton Station represented something more, a deliberate intrusion into the deepest, least understood part of our planet, a place where the very bedrock might hold secrets not meant for human eyes. My specialty, xenogeology, was usually reserved for theoretical extraterrestrial analysis. Here, at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, I was convinced we'd find something that would redefine terrestrial entirely. This wasn't just a job, it was a pilgrimage. The Nautilus II nudged gently against a massive, barnacle-encrusted hatch. The operations manager, a woman whose eyes held the weary wisdom of too many deep-sea deployments, leaned forward. Pressure equalization initiated. This might take a while. Station's been dormant for decades. Decades. Long time for anything to sit undisturbed in this environment. What had they left behind? Why had they left? The official reports were vague, citing unforeseen operational difficulties and resource reallocation. But I knew better. No one abandons a multi-billion-dollar deep-sea research facility without a damn good reason. Hours later, after a series of agonizingly slow depressurization cycles and manual overrides, we finally cycled through the primary airlock. The air inside Triton Station was stale, thick with the scent of ozone, damp metal, and something else, a faint metallic tang I couldn't quite place. Our helmet lamps cut stark tunnels through the gloom, revealing vast, silent corridors lined with rusting equipment. Water dripped rhythmically from unseen pipes, each splash amplifying the station's desolate emptiness. Power conduits look stable enough for auxiliary systems, the engineer announced, his voice tight. But the main grid is shot. We'll need to reroute from the geothermal core. My focus, however, was already pulling me deeper. The station schematics I'd memorized pointed to a specific section, an older part of the complex, designated as a geological survey annex. This was where the original team had made their most peculiar discoveries, according to the redacted logs. And it was there that I expected to find the answers to Triton's abandonment. Let's move towards the lower decks, I said, my voice resonating with an authority I hadn't realized I possessed. I want to assess the structural integrity of the geological annex first, specifically the flooded basement complex. The operations manager shot me a look, a flicker of concern in her eyes. The flooded basement complex, that section was sealed off, structural collapse risk, and the water, it's not just seawater. I'm aware of the reports. I countered, my resolve hardening, and that's precisely why we need to examine it. Anomalous geological runoff. It could be key to understanding the regional tectonics. It was a half-truth. I suspected it was key to understanding everything. Navigating the station was a labyrinthine chore. We moved through abandoned laboratories, silent crew quarters, past control rooms where dust motes danced in our lamp beams, illuminating ghostly consoles. The silence was occasionally punctuated by the groan of stressed metal, the distant thrum of the station settling, or the unsettling gurgle of unseen water moving through the walls. Finally, we reached a heavy, rusted bulkhead, its warning labels faded to illegibility. "This is it," I confirmed, tapping the thick metal with a gloved hand. Access point to the flooded basement complex. The engineer worked methodically, his tools whining and sparking as he cut through the corroded locks. When the bulkhead finally hissed open, a wave of frigid, mineral-rich water surged out, splashing against our boots. My lamp beam pierced the opening, revealing a vast, cavernous space completely submerged. The water, murky and still, reflected our lights like a broken mirror, distorting the rusted catwalks and submerged machinery that lined the perimeter. The air above the waterline hung heavy, thick with the smell of brine and something else, something subtly acrid, like old batteries mixed with damp earth. "Well, this is charming," the operations manager muttered, her voice barely audible over the rush of water. I ignored her, stepping onto the first slick rung of a submerged ladder, dense, heavy. It seemed to absorb the light from my lamp, refusing to yield its secrets. As I descended, the sound of my own breathing amplified in my helmet, a frantic rhythm against the profound quiet of the flooded complex. I swept my lamp across the submerged landscape, pipes snaked along the floor, half buried in the muck. Pressure gauges, their dials frozen, peered from the gloom like blind eyes, and then I saw it, not an artifact, not yet, but a subtle distortion. A section of the concrete wall, near where the geological core conduits would have passed, seemed to ripple, not like water, but like the very fabric of the wall itself was warping, shifting. The lines of the concrete didn't quite align. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible visual anomaly, a trick of the light, perhaps. But my training, my years spent analyzing the impossible geometries of deep earth formations, screamed otherwise. My breath hitched. This was it. This was the beginning. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, the distinct sensation of being watched, not by a creature, but by the very space around me. The bulkhead finally hissed open, a wave of frigid, mineral-rich water surged out, splashing against our boots. My lamp beam pierced the opening, cutting through the swirling murk. Before us stretched a long, waterlogged corridor, the entrance to the flooded basement complex. The air, heavy and still, carried a metallic tang that was sharper now, laced with the smell of decay and something else, something ancient and inert. "Well, this is it," I murmured, my voice sounding thin in the cavernous silence. The engineer, a broad-shouldered man with a grease-smudged face, sloshed forward, his headlamp sweeping the space. Water reached our shins, cold and unyielding, reflecting the dancing light of our beams. The biologist, usually effusive, was quiet, her gaze fixed on the water, perhaps already cataloging the unseen microbial life thriving in this forgotten place. The corridor was a testament to neglect. Cables, thick as my arm, dangled like dead vines from the ceiling, their insulation cracked and peeling. Pipes, encrusted with rust and some strange, calcified growth, snaked along the walls, dripping rhythmic echoes into the standing water. Every step we took sent ripples across the surface, disturbing the film of dust and detritus that had settled undisturbed for decades. The silence was the most profound thing, though, a heavy blanket that smothered any sound save our own labored breathing and the splash of our boots. It felt less like an abandoned structure and more like a tomb. "The main power conduits should be this way," the engineer stated, pointing to a wider passage partially obscured by a collapsed section of grating. "If we can find a junction, we might be able to get auxiliary lights on." We waded deeper into the complex. My lamp picked out familiar console panels, now nothing but corroded husks, their screens opaque with grime. I reached out, my gloved fingers tracing the outline of a once important switch, now fused solid. This was Triton Station, or what was left of it. As a xenogeologist, my mind was always attuned to the Earth's subtle shifts, its hidden structures. Here, though, it was something else entirely. There was a faint resonance, a low hum beneath the natural vibrations of the deep, that tugged at my awareness. It wasn't seismic, not geological in any way I understood. It was, I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure I was, just a feeling, something about the rock here. I gestured vaguely at the wall, where the natural, uneven texture of the cave-in met a surprisingly smooth, almost polished section of wall. It wasn't exposed bedrock, it was a construction, not visible to the casual glance, but my eyes, trained to spot anomalies, saw the faint, almost invisible seam. I moved closer, splashing through the knee-deep water. The others watched me, their lamps converging on the spot. "This isn't natural," I said, running my fingers along the seam. It was too perfect, too straight for a cave wall. This wall, it's a cover. The engineer, intrigued, came over, his tools clanking faintly. A concealed panel for what? I didn't answer, already probing the seam, searching for a latch, a mechanism. The low hum intensified in my skull, a pressure behind my eyes. It wasn't a sound, but a direct input, a signal that vibrated through the very marrow of my bones. This was it. This was what had called to me. After several tense minutes of prying and scraping, the engineer managed to wedge a pry bar into a hairline crack. A fresh wave of the indescribable hum washed over me, stronger now, almost overwhelming. My lamp beam, usually so definitive, seemed to waver as it pierced the opening. The chamber beyond was small, barely larger than a storage closet, and strangely dry. The air here was utterly still, devoid of the complex's usual mineral tang. It pulsed with a soft, internal luminescence, casting a faint, unearthly glow on the surrounding walls. It was crystalline, yes, but unlike any crystal I had ever seen. Its structure defied geometry, defying the very rules of space I knew. Angles twisted back on themselves, corners met where they shouldn't, and surfaces seemed to fold inward, impassibly, creating a form that was both solid and impossibly complex. My mind struggled to process it, to categorize it, and in that struggle a profound disquiet began to blossom within me. The light it gave off wasn't just illumination, it was information, raw and unfiltered. It seeped into me, not through my eyes, but directly into my consciousness, bypassing all sensory organs. It spoke of scale, of distances, of truths that shattered the comforting illusions of my world. It was an impossible, silent scream of indifference. I felt a dizzying lurch, as if the floor beneath me had dropped away. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a revelation, a terrible, silent truth emanating from impossible angles and glowing, crystalline surfaces. I could feel my perception of reality beginning to fray at the edges, a fragile tapestry unraveling under the weight of something truly, terrifyingly other. I didn't answer, my fingers already probing the seam, searching for a latch, a mechanism. The low hum intensified in my skull, a pressure behind my eyes that wasn't a headache, but a direct input, a signal that vibrated through the very marrow of my bones. This was it. This was what had called to me, a silent siren song echoing in the abyss. The seam yielded with a groan that seemed to reverberate not from the metal, but from the water-laden air itself. A thin sliver of darkness widened, revealing not an empty cavity, but a chamber beyond, partially submerged in the frigid brine of the flooded basement complex. The air, thick with the metallic tang of old machinery and the faint, sweet decay of long stagnant water, pressed against my suit. Then I saw it. It wasn't a machine, nor a sculpture, nor any natural formation I had ever encountered in all my years studying the anomalies of the deep. It sat at the approximate center of the small, waterlogged chamber, roughly the size of a compacted service drone. Its surface was a tessellation of planes and angles that defied geometry. Yet simultaneously, my eyes registered faint, iridescent gleams that seemed to shift and shimmer within its impassable structure, like oil on water, but without the water. It was a paradox made manifest, a shape that my mind struggled to contain, like trying to remember a dream just after waking. The hum intensified, not just in my skull, but now it felt as though it emanated directly from the artifact, resonating through my suit, through the very hull of Triton Station. It wasn't sound, but pure concept, an intrusive thought that wasn't mine. Truth, unveiled. "Marcus, what do you see?" The station chief's voice crackled, cutting through the strange resonance. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. I've never seen anything like it. It's not of this world, not in any geological sense. I took a step closer, the water in the chamber swirling around my boots, disturbed by my movement. The air around the artifact seemed to waver, like heat haze off asphalt, except the temperature gauge on my console read a steady 4 degrees Celsius. It wasn't words, not yet. Just the impression of a voice, a phantom vibration in the deep quiet. "Describe it. Give me specifics," the station chief pressed. "It's non-Euclidean," I managed, the word feeling inadequate, a gross simplification. "Angles that don't add up. Surfaces that fold in on themselves. It's like looking at a conceptual error given physical form." As I spoke, the light in the chamber flickered, not just the beam from my suit lamp, but the ambient emergency lights embedded in the ceiling of the flooded basement complex. A momentary dimming, a stutter, then they flared back to full intensity. On my wrist console, the environmental integrity readings for the immediate area briefly spiked, then flatlined, then corrected. A glitch. Nothing more. The deep-sea environment was notoriously hard on electronics. Readings on it? The technician asked, his voice tight. I extended a manipulator arm, its sensors sweeping over the artifact. The console displayed a chaotic mess, energy signatures off the charts, matter density fluctuating wildly, a temporal distortion field that made no sense. My eyes strained, trying to make sense of the artifact's geometry, and for a split second, the wall behind it seemed to ripple, the metal plating appearing to curve inward, then snap back to flat. My breath hitched. Fatigue, I told myself. Optical illusion from the flickering lights. The pressure was immense down here, playing tricks on the mind. The readings are anomalous, I reported, forcing my voice to remain steady. Off the charts. It felt like 1,000 tiny voices all speaking at once, yet none of them forming discernible words. My head throbbed. I closed my eyes for a moment, pressing my gloved hand against my helmet, trying to clear the phantom noise. When I opened them, the shimmering around the artifact seemed more pronounced, the air itself vibrating with an invisible frequency. Marcus, are I all right? The station chief asked, a note of concern entering his tone. Fine, I lied, my determination solidifying. This was unprecedented. This was discovery. My mind, trained for years to observe, categorize, and rationalize, latched onto the scientific imperative. Just the sheer strangeness of it. It's unlike anything we've ever encountered. I reached out, my gloved hand hovering inches from one of its impossibly angled surfaces. The air between my palm and the artifact felt thick, almost viscous, pushing back against me. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled my hand back, my heart racing. Stress, I rationalized again. The profound isolation, the pressure, the sheer cognitive load of processing something so utterly alien. It had to be. My mission was clear. Understand this anomaly, and I would, even if it meant my senses waged war against me. I recoiled, my hand snapping back from the impossible angles of the artifact. The air indeed had felt viscous, a tangible barrier pushing against my gloved palm. The whispers, a chaotic chorus, didn't just resonate behind my ears. They seemed to vibrate through my very bones, a discordant symphony of a million unseen voices screaming without sound. Unintelligible, yet somehow profoundly known. I staggered back, bumping into the excavation rig. The metal groaned under the slight impact, a mundane sound that momentarily anchored me. My breath hitched, not from exertion, but from the sudden, profound chill that had seeped into my core despite the insulated suit. This wasn't just a discovery, it was an intrusion, a violation of everything I understood about existence. Marcus, I all right down there? The comms officer's voice crackled through my helmet, a welcome human interruption. Fine, I lied, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. Just a lot to process. We're securing the site, I'm heading back up. Leaving the artifact was harder than I anticipated. My eyes kept darting back to its obsidian surfaces, its geometry shifting subtly, or so it seemed, under the harsh glare of our work lights. It was like trying to walk away from a gaping wound you knew you shouldn't touch, yet couldn't stop staring at. I made my way through the narrow, waterlogged corridors of the flooded basement complex, the metallic tang of the deep sea mingling with the stale, recycled air of the station. Pipes, thick with barnacles and rust, snaked along the bulkheads, their purpose long forgotten. This entire station felt like a forgotten tomb, and we, the unwitting grave robbers. When I finally reached the main operations chamber, the atmosphere was tight, brittle. The comms officer, usually a picture of calm efficiency, was hunched over his console, fingers flying across the holographic interface. His brow was furrowed, a vein throbbing in his temple. Marcus, thank the deep. We've got a problem, he said, not looking up. Surface storm, massive one, it just swallowed our comms array whole. We're blind. My stomach dropped. Blind as in no contact at all. He shook his head, a grim line across his lips. Nothing. Emergency protocols initiated, but it's a full whiteout up there. They won't even know we're gone for another 12 hours minimum, and by then. He didn't need to finish the sentence. By then, who knew what could happen? We were trapped, hundreds of miles beneath the churning fury of the Pacific, with a storm raging above and an incomprehensible artifact radiating an unknown influence. But over the next few hours, the isolation pressed in, a physical weight. They weren't just in the flooded basement complex anymore, they were everywhere. A constant low thrum beneath the hum of the station's life support, a sensation of being perpetually on the verge of understanding something terrible. I tried to dismiss it, to attribute it to fatigue, to the stress of our situation. But I knew, deep down, it was the artifact. Its presence permeated the very structure, seeping into our minds like a slow-acting toxin. That night, the nightmares began. I woke to a guttural scream that tore through the quiet of my sleeping pod. I shot upright, my heart racing, fumbling for the emergency light. The comms officer's pod was across the corridor, his door ajar. I heard muffled sobs, then the ragged gasps of someone fighting for air. "What happened?" I asked, rushing over. He was curled in a fetal position, trembling, his face pale and slick with sweat. His eyes were wide, unfocused, staring at something only he could see. "The shapes, Marcus," he stammered, his voice raw. "They weren't right. They folded in on themselves and the voices. They said things that." He described impossible geometries, colors that defied the spectrum, and concepts that unraveled the very fabric of his understanding. Later, the geophysicist recounted a dream of vast, indifferent spaces, where stars were merely pinpricks in a canvas of non-existence, and he was nothing less than nothing. The engineer spoke of structures that warped reality, where up was down and inside was out, and her own body felt alien to her. I pretended to offer logical explanations: stress, deep-sea psychosis, sensory deprivation. But the words tasted like ash in my mouth. I knew, we all knew. The artifact was calling to me. It wanted me back. My scientific curiosity, once a controlled flame, now felt like a raging inferno stoked by an unknown fuel. It wasn't just about understanding it anymore. It was an undeniable primal urge. I had to return to the flooded basement complex. I had to see it again. I had to touch it. I found myself drifting towards the access hatch, my feet moving of their own accord. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn back, but the compulsion was stronger. The geophysicist's voice, raspy and thin, still echoed in my ears. He described an unsettling visual, not a solid object, but a shimmering, impossible geometry that pulsed at the edge of his vision, making the familiar console readouts twist into indecipherable glyphs. He called it the shifting grid, a framework of reality that was no longer fixed. His account had ended abruptly, with him clutching his head, mumbling about the true angles of existence. I tried to get more out of him, but he'd simply curled into a ball, shaking. I walked the narrow corridors of the station, the hum of life support systems a dull thrum against the oppressive silence of the deep. My own mind felt like a drum, each beat a slow, deliberate thud against the inside of my skull. The whispers I'd heard before, faint and teasing, had begun to coalesce. They weren't words, not exactly, but a cascade of pure concept, flooding my thoughts with an understanding that felt both ancient and utterly new. It spoke of connections, of underlying structures, of a vastness that dwarfed anything I'd ever conceived. And with it, the visual distortions began to manifest with alarming clarity. I was heading towards the main observation deck, needing to see the exterior, to reassure myself of the familiar, when the corridor walls rippled. It wasn't a trick of the light, nor a fault in the structural integrity. The steel plates seemed to flex and fold, not into each other, but through each other, creating impossible intersections that defied the laws of three-dimensional space. A corner I knew to be a 90-degree angle suddenly presented a sharp, acute edge, then a wide, obtuse curve, all within the span of a single blink. This was no longer just a whisper in my mind. It was a visible rupture in the very fabric of my perception. Later, in the cramped mess hall, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. The submersible pilot, a gruff woman who prided herself on her unflappable demeanor, sat picking at her nutrient paste. "My depth gauge, it keeps showing negative readings," she muttered, not looking at anyone. "Like we're falling through the trench, not just in it. And the sonar, it's picking up echoes from inside the station. Impossible." The communications specialist, usually a chatterbox, stared blankly at a wall panel. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a mug. "The signal from the surface, it's not just static. It's patterned like a code, but not one I recognize, and it's getting stronger. It feels like it's talking to me." He didn't elaborate, but his eyes, wide and bloodshot, held a depth of fear I understood all too well. Each shared anomaly, each fleeting glimpse into the impossible, bred a fresh layer of paranoia. We started watching each other, not just for signs of distress, but for any hint of understanding, any flicker of recognition of the truth that was slowly consuming us. Dr. Sharma, usually the most grounded among us, had become a shadow of her former self. She spent her hours in the bioluminescence lab, surrounded by her glowing samples, but her focus wasn't on the flora. He was tracing patterns on the condensation-streaked viewport with her finger, intricate and repetitive designs that bore no resemblance to anything natural. When I tried to speak to her, she just hummed, a tuneless, low sound, her eyes distant. "It's all connected, Marcus," she'd finally said, her voice soft, almost a sigh. "The currents, the light refraction, the way the molecules align. There's a geometry to it, a song, and it's so elegant." She didn't look up, her gaze fixed on the swirling, almost hypnotic patterns he was creating. The station's lower levels, particularly the flooded basement complex, had always been off-limits, unless absolutely necessary. Now, a critical pump system was failing, threatening to compromise the integrity of the entire structure. I volunteered to go. The heavy pressure door groaned open, revealing a cavernous space half submerged in murky, frigid water. The metallic tang of rust mingled with the faint, unsettling scent of stagnant brine. They were no longer abstract concepts, but urgent, insistent declarations, revealing the hidden connections between the water, the metal, the very particles in the air. I saw the lines of force, the vectors of pressure, the unseen architecture that held everything together, and the places where that architecture frayed, where it bent into shapes that should not exist. A support column, thick with marine growth, seemed to undulate, its solid form flickering at the edges. The ceiling, too high to properly discern, appeared to fold in on itself, creating a series of nested, impossible angles that swam in my peripheral vision. The pump system was ahead, a hulking mass of corroded machinery. As I approached, the low hum of its failing motor seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but within my bones. I saw it then, clearly, undeniably. The pump's casing, meant to be a perfect cylinder, was subtly warped, its circular cross-sections subtly shifting, becoming an ellipse, then something else, something with too many sides, then too few, all while remaining undeniably a cylinder. It was a paradox made manifest, a vision that simultaneously affirmed and denied its own existence. This wasn't just a failing pump, it was a physical embodiment of the truth that was dismantling my world. The air in the access tunnel was thick with the metallic tang of salt and decay. Water, frigid and black, sloshed around my knees as I waded deeper. The beam of my headlamp cutting a narrow path through the gloom. The hum of the station's failing life support systems vibrated through the steel deck plating beneath my boots. The communications specialist's words still echoed in my mind, patterned, not one I recognize, getting stronger. It was a persistent thrum against the rising dread, a separate discord in the symphony of the station's demise. I reached the bulkhead leading to the flooded basement complex. The pressure seal was compromised, water steadily pouring through a hairline fracture, mixing with the already stagnant pool. Pushing the heavy door open required a grunt of effort, the rusty hinges screaming in protest. The space beyond was vast and echoing, a submerged cathedral of forgotten machinery and corroded pipes. My light caught the glint of discarded tools, a workstation half submerged, and then the artifact. It pulsed with a dim, internal light, not an illumination, but an absence of shadow that seemed to ripple across its impossible geometry. I pulled my mapping gear from my waterproof pack, a portable laser grid scanner, a high-frequency sonar unit, and a reinforced measuring tape, old habits dying hard. I needed data, something tangible, anything to make sense of the encroaching chaos. I set it to a wide sweep, watching the holographic projection flicker to life. The grid lines, usually so crisp and precise, warped as they contacted the artifact. They bent, twisted, and sometimes simply ceased to exist, replaced by blank spaces or overlapping segments that defied all Euclidean logic. The scanner whirred, struggling, its internal diagnostics flashing a cascade of errors I'd never seen before. I tried the sonar next. The transducer sent out its sharp pings, designed to bounce back and paint a clear picture of submerged objects. But the returns from the artifact were garbled, like echoes from multiple dimensions colliding at once. The display showed impossible angles, surfaces that folded in on themselves, and volumes that were simultaneously concave and convex. It wasn't just a misreading, it was as if the artifact itself actively rejected conventional spatial measurement. This was crafted. This was built. It was artificial. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Something had made this. Something that perceived reality in a fundamentally different way. They weren't just chaotic thoughts anymore. They were coalescing, forming into fragmented concepts, alien and terrifying in their nascent coherence. I saw a glimpse of a sky without stars, not empty, but filled with a diffuse, shifting luminescence that implied a different kind of space, a space where up and down were meaningless, where light itself was a fluid, living thing. I felt, rather than heard, a profound indifference emanating from the very fabric of existence, a cosmic shrug that dwarfed all human striving, all hope, all fear. It was a truth so stark, so utterly devoid of meaning, that it threatened to strip away the very concept of myself. My knuckles were white. This wasn't some trick of the mind. This was a direct feed, an unfiltered signal from something utterly beyond. The communications specialist's patterned signal. Was this what he was tapping into? A universal broadcast not meant for human ears or minds. I forced myself to breathe, a ragged, shuddering gasp in the heavy air. I took out the physical measuring tape, a pathetic, almost defiant gesture. I stretched it towards the nearest edge of the artifact, where its surface met the water. The tape, stiff and metallic, touched the obsidian-like material, and then, inexplicably, it bent. Not at a joint, not from pressure, but the very material of the tape itself warped, following a curve that wasn't there, a non-existent angle dictated by the artifact's presence. This wasn't just non-Euclidean, it was actively reshaping local reality. My mind raced, trying to grasp what this meant. If the fundamental rules of geometry could be bent, twisted, or negated by its proximity, what else could it do? What was it doing to us? The others, the way they'd been acting. The engineer's quiet despair, the geologist's sudden manic laughter, the communications specialist's unnerving calm about the signal. They weren't just suffering psychological breaks. They were being rewritten. The fragmented concepts intensified, pressing against the inside of my skull. Not words, but pure ideas. Existence as a transient ripple, perception as a fragile illusion, reality as a consensus easily shattered. I felt a desperate urge to run, to flee this silent, terrifying revelation, but my feet were rooted to the submerged deck. My determination, however, was still there, a thin, burning ember against the gale of cosmic indifference. I had to understand. I had to know, even if the knowing tore me apart. The water in the access tunnel climbed past my knees, a frigid, black current that pulled at my boots with an insistent drag. Each step was a deliberate, heavy effort, the beam of my headlamp a frantic, solitary eye against the encroaching murk. The metallic tang of salt and decay intensified, clinging to the back of my throat, a taste of rust and forgotten things. Above the slosh of my movement, the station's failing life support systems pulsed with a ragged, wheezing hum, a sound like a dying leviathan trying to draw breath. It vibrated through the steel deck beneath my feet, a low, constant thrum that felt less like a machine and more like a heartbeat struggling against a crushing weight. I pushed deeper, the tunnel twisting, its steel ribs slick with condensation. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of ozone and something else, something cloying and sweet, like fermenting fear. My thoughts, once a flood of logical deduction and desperate planning, had become a sluggish river, occasionally snagging on strange, sharp fragments. I kept seeing the pattern, not just on the artifact, but everywhere in the rust stains on the bulkhead, in the way the water rippled, in the very structure of my own blinking. A constant, unwelcome clarity that felt like a violation. The tunnel finally opened into the flooded basement complex. The space was vast and echoing, a cavern of submerged machinery and shadowed walkways. Water, dark and still, stretched across the entire floor, reflecting the anemic emergency lights that flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. A labyrinth of conduits and pipes snaked along the walls, some sparking intermittently with faint, venomous blue light, their exposed wiring a silent threat. I saw them then, huddled on a narrow catwalk that ran along the far wall just above the waterline. The engineer, hunched over a console, his face pale and drawn, muttering to himself. Their figures were grotesque in the flickering light, elongated and distorted by the water's reflection. "Engineer," I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the cavernous space. "Security officer." The engineer flinched, his head snapping up, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Marcus, what are I doing here?" I told. "They're watching, always watching." He gestured vaguely at the ceiling, then at the water. His hands trembled, a rapid, uncontrollable tremor. The security officer spun around, raising his rifle, the muzzle tracking towards me. "Identify myself, who's there?" His voice was hoarse, strained. "It's Marcus, put the weapon down." My own voice held a strange, flat quality. The fear that should have been there, the surge of adrenaline, was absent. The security officer lowered his rifle slightly, but his grip remained white-knuckled. "I shouldn't be here. There are things in the water. They follow the light." "There's nothing in the water but water," I said, wading towards the catwalk. Submerged debris scraped against my boots. "I don't know," the engineer hissed, scrambling to his feet, knocking over a stack of tools with a clatter that echoed eerily. "I don't know. It's all connected. The hum, the patterns, it's a language. They're speaking to us." He pointed a trembling finger at the security officer. "He thinks I'm trying to cut the feed. He thinks I'm one of them." "He is," the security officer snarled, stepping forward, blocking the engineer's path along the catwalk. "I saw him. He was trying to disable the perimeter sensors. Let them in." "I was trying to fix them, I imbecile," the engineer shrieked, his voice cracking. "They're faulty, they're showing phantoms." He lunged for the security officer, not with any real force, but with a desperate, flailing madness. The security officer, startled, reacted instantly. He brought the butt of his rifle up, not to strike, but to push the engineer away. But his movements were jerky, uncoordinated, fueled by paranoia. The catwalk was narrow, slick with condensation. The engineer, caught off balance, stumbled. His arms windmilled wildly, his shriek abruptly cut short as he pitched over the railing. There was a sickening splash as he hit the dark water. Not a clean entry, but a heavier, duller sound, followed by a sharp crack that reverberated through the complex. The emergency lights flickered, briefly plunging the area into deeper gloom, then stuttered back to life. He must have hit one of the submerged conduits, or perhaps a sharp edge of the machinery. His headlamp, still active, cast a wavering circle of light onto the murky bottom, illuminating the twisted metal and shattered pipes below. The security officer stood frozen on the catwalk, his rifle still clutched, his eyes wide, staring at the still form in the water. His breath came in ragged gasps. I didn't mean to, he just fell. I said nothing. My mind was already dissecting the scene. The angle of the fall, the probable impact point, the lack of struggle, it simply took him. Just another element in the vast, uncaring calculus of this place. The suddenness of it, the raw, brutal finality should have shocked me, but I felt only a profound, almost academic interest. Another variable removed. Another piece of the puzzle rearranged. The security officer sank to his knees, his rifle clattering softly against the steel. He stared at the engineer's body, then at me, a desperate, animalistic fear in his eyes. Morale, what little remained, had not just shattered. It had been pulverized into fine dust, scattered by an invisible, indifferent wind. The cold, indifferent water, it simply took him. The suddenness of it, the raw, brutal finality should have... I didn't finish the thought. There was no point. The engineering chief was gone, and the others, what few remained, were shadows. Sleep offered no refuge. It had become a gateway, a forced initiation. I would drift into slumber, exhausted by the relentless pressure, only to be dragged into a realm that defied every law of physics, every comfort of geometry. My head throbbed, a relentless drumbeat behind my eyes. I could feel the tremors in my hands even when I was awake, a constant, low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from my bones. Nausea was my constant companion, a queasy knot in my gut that no amount of ration bars or stale water could appease. These were the physical manifestations, the body's pathetic attempts to reject the knowledge being forced upon it. The first vision was of light, not seen with eyes, but felt with an inner organ that didn't exist until that moment. It was a light that wasn't light, but the absence of it, somehow brighter than any star. Within its impossible glow, shapes began to coalesce. Not creatures, not beings, but concepts given form. They writhed and stretched across dimensions I couldn't grasp, their movements defining new laws of physics as they occurred. I saw entities that were simultaneously immense and infinitesimal, their presence a distortion in existence itself. One, a vast, pulsating nebula of pure thought, flowed through impassable angles, its form shifting with every non-Euclidean turn. It wasn't alive in any way I understood. It simply was an indifferent, eternal process. The landscapes were worse. I found myself standing on plains of glass that stretched to horizons that folded back on themselves. I would try to orient myself, the familiar metallic tang of the station's recycled air a small comfort, but the visions lingered. They stained the edges of my waking perception. The hum of the life support systems began to sound like the distant, rhythmic breathing of the nebula entity. One afternoon, I found myself in the flooded basement complex, trying to assess the extent of the water ingress. But as I stared, the reflections began to warp. The surface of the water became a canvas for the visions. I saw not the corroded pipes and submerged conduits, but the glass planes, the lightless stars. I knelt, dipping my hand into the frigid reality, trying to push away the illusion, but my fingers passed through the glass planes, through the cosmic wounds, feeling the impossible textures of a non-existent world. The tremors intensified, shaking my entire frame. I felt a scream building in my chest, but no sound escaped. It wasn't just sights and sounds anymore. It was an understanding, seeping into my very core. The truth wasn't something to be discovered. It was something to be unmade by. I saw the vast indifference of the cosmos, not as an abstract concept, but as a living, breathing entity. It didn't care for life, for struggle, for meaning. It simply was an endless, unfathomable process of existence where humanity was less than a speck of dust, an inconsequential flicker. Our hopes, our fears, our very consciousness, all of it was a fleeting aberration in a universe that had no memory of us, nor any intention of ever acknowledging our brief, pathetic blip. This wasn't knowledge that brought power or even clarity. It was a corrosive acid, dissolving the foundations of my sanity, stripping away every layer of what I thought it meant to be Marcus Blake. I was becoming an open conduit, a receiver for frequencies too vast, too ancient, too true for the human mind to bear. The physical pain was a dull ache compared to the agony of this new awareness. Every fiber of my being screamed for ignorance, for the comforting lie of a benevolent or even malevolent universe. But there was only the indifferent, incomprehensible truth laid bare in the relentless, invasive visions. I saw myself not as a scientist, but as a fractured vessel filled to bursting with a reality that was never meant for human eyes. The final revelation was not a flash of insight, but a slow, agonizing unraveling. The cosmic entities weren't monsters, they were simply there, and in their unimaginable, unfeeling existence, they revealed the ultimate, horrifying truth. Nothing mattered. Not my life, not the lives of my colleagues, not the Earth, not the Sun, not even the galaxies themselves. We were less than dust motes in a beam of light that didn't care to illuminate us. My mind, once a fortress of logic and reason, was now a shattered pane, letting in the full, terrifying expanse. It wasn't the peace of acceptance, but the peace of utter annihilation. My human self. The Marcus I knew was gone.